Legends of Tomorrow, yeah. Correctly identified by Ed.
Yes, very important knowledge.
Uh-huh.
I have wasted my life, clearly.
Not at
I've made bad
all.
choices, guys.
This is, I feel like this is a sign that you're not wasting your life. Like, in between important scientific research, you gotta have a little Bebo.
Right. Everyone has very good backdrops. I need to make a good backdrop.
That's the same thing I said. I was like, oh, I'm feeling really lacking in the backdrop.
I don't know. I feel like, Rebecca, you have an amazing backdrop because you look like you're in like a beautiful like Athenaeum or something like that.
Oh, good.
So, yeah,
Yeah,
you could always
right.
just say it was a backdrop, you know, like, yes, this is the Athenaeum at some well-known location.
Oh, funny. Right on.
I'm trying to do some kind of regal accent.
There we go.
Oh, not very nice, Ed.
See?
Whoa.
Dang.
Topical.
Yeah.
Whipped it out really fast.
I know. Like he was kind of ready to do the backdrop smackdown. So I think we can start letting people in if you're not already letting them in. Okay. Update. So, all right. So we're heading into noon. Is this, should we get started? Do we have enough? Have folks gotten in? And I'm seeing a nod from our thumbs up. All right. So hello, everybody. I'm Annalee Newitz. I am here with We Love Bookstores, which is a series that we've been doing now for about 3 months. And we've raised thousands of dollars for local bookstores in the Bay Area. It's been a great success and we've really loved doing it. Today, we are going to talk about science, which is, of course, my favorite thing to talk about. And we have two incredible science journalists here. We are just so lucky that we grabbed them and stuck them inside little boxes on the internet and they agreed to talk. So I'm going to introduce them and we'll talk for a little bit and then we'll open it up for questions, which you can ask by text. In the chat window. And I should add before I introduce our humans that this is a benefit for East Bay Booksellers, which is a fantastic bookstore in Oakland, formerly known as Diesel. And it's been around for 27 years. They're an incredible community. They have an amazing selection of books. And it's not like so many bookstores. It's not just a bookstore. It's just a fantastic place to hang out while social distancing and wearing your mask and obeying all rules of shelter in place. So with me today on the human front, we have Rebecca Skloot, who is the author of the terrific book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which became an HBO movie with Oprah Winfrey. She also has written for the New York Times Magazine, the Oprah Magazine, and many other publications. She has worked as a correspondent for WNYC's Radiolab, PBS's Nova Science Now, and she and her father, Floyd Skloot, co-edited The Best American Science Writing in 2011. And we also have Ed Yong, who is a science journalist at The Atlantic, where you can read his stuff all the time online. He's also the author of the bestseller, I Contain Multitudes, which is an amazing, amazing book, which you should definitely check out. He's also written for National Geographic, The New Yorker, Wired, Nature, New Scientist, Scientific American, and many other places with science in the title. He's won a ton of awards, and he used to, back in the day, if you're cool enough, like me, you remember that he had a blog called Not Exactly Rocket Science. And that is where it all started, back in the days when we had blogs. So I want to just start by asking you guys the question that we always begin with, which is, tell us a little bit about what bookstores mean to you, independent bookstores mean to you. And I know, Rebecca, you actually live near East Bay Booksellers, so maybe you could start.
Yeah. Oh God, what do they mean? So I have so many different. I have so many different things that they mean. I'm actually in Portland, Oregon right now. I kind of divide my time between being next to Powell's and being next to the East Bay bookstore. That's kind of how I think of it. And in high school, I grew up basically just going to Powell's and getting lost in the aisles and hanging out in the coffee shops. I actually used to skip school and go hang out at Powell's, which is like the ultimate nerdy kid thing to do.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, but for me, I mean, I think, you know, one of the most important things for me in terms of the independent booksellers is just the way that they helped me get the Immortal Life out to the world. You know, Henrietta's story was I always knew that if I could just get it in front of people, and if people could hear about it, they would get it and they would want to read it and they would care about it. And, the publicity machines at big publishing houses, they're giant, and they don't always, with the first book, and it was a science book, and they were like, we think this is wonderful and amazing, but I didn't have a huge publicity engine behind me. And so about a year before the books came out, I just started reaching out to people online, and I created, this was in the very early days of Google Maps, where you could create an editable Google map. So I created a Google map, and I divided the country into 4 quadrants. And I was like, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months from the publication date. I was like, I will be in these quadrants if the world can get me there. And I basically was like, I will leave my house the day before the book comes out, and I will go. It started on the East Coast. And I just said, if somebody can help me get to each area, put me up on your couches, whatever, I'll do whatever events people want me to do. I'll come and talk to your books, to your classes. I'll go to the bookstores. And the indies just were amazing. I mean, some of it was, individuals. This was also the early days of Twitter. And so this was kind of a lot of words started spreading there. But so individual people who thought the book was important and that they wanted people to know the story would reach out to a local indie, and they'd say, what can we do to get her here? And so the book, it eventually just kind of exploded when it came out. But a lot of that was a whole year's worth of a kind of grassroots effort on the part of indie booksellers and people who care about indie booksellers and go to indie booksellers, saying, we've got to get this person and this story and put it in a room and let her explain it to people. And that's really why the book took off the way it did. And then, the indies just hand selling it and saying, really, you need to know this story, even though it's about science. And even though it sounds like maybe it's gonna be hard because it's about cells, trust me, you're gonna love it. And that just doesn't happen anywhere else. I think the world of books just depends on that so much to get the important stories out. Yeah.
That's so great. Ed, do you have any indie bookstore anecdotes or thoughts?
Yeah, I just have very strong memories of being a kid so I grew up in Malaysia and didn't really have a ton of bookstores, indie or otherwise, around me. And I remember going to London for the first time when I was 7 and going to Foyles. And Foyles now is sort of distressingly shiny and slick. But back in the day, it was this kind of Hogwartsian, magical wonderland of wooden shelves where books were not so much stacked as just kind of every possible direction. It was just really intricate tessellation exercise that they were playing, and it was kind of glorious and magical and something I had never seen before. And I think I filled my luggage and my parents' luggage with books to just take back to I'm going to hoard books. I'm 2 years supply of books to last me through to the next time I go to London.
That's so awesome. I also love Foyles. The first time I went there, they were still in that early incarnation of scarred tables and
right.
It really did.
Yeah.
It was magical. It's still magical. Still go to Foyles, of course, but yeah. So I wanted to start by asking both of you something, because you both had incredibly successful books about microbiology. And Rebecca, you were already saying that sometimes it's a little hard getting people interested in cells. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how, what kind of strategies you guys have used in your science writing to get people excited about microbiology and kind of connect people to it and help them understand how it fits into their lives. Rebecca, you want to go first, or Ed? Ed, why don't you go first, Ed? Because Rebecca went first before. You're both very polite, so.
Either that or just wishing the other person would go first. Yeah.
Okay, so it's not easy writing about microbes because by their nature they are invisible, and because to the extent that they influence people's lives in a tangible, observable way, it's when they make them sick. And so we has now associated microbes with death and decay and dirt. So we want to get rid of them. We don't want to read a whole book about them. But I think that there are several things about the microbiome and the ways microbes influence the lives of humans and other animals that make them actually a surprisingly easy sell. One of the ways is that they influence human health, but that is specifically something I didn't really want to get into that much in the book. Like, the book was not a health book, it wasn't a food book, it had no recipes in it. But there are a ton of great stories of people who study microbes and who have worked on the fringes of their own respective fields and have now sort of coalesced into a field in their own right. And like, one very easy way of getting people to care about microbes is to get people to care about the people who care about microbes. Like, if you can show this weird subculture of folks is inordinately interested in this one thing, it does kind of give you a clue that that thing is actually interesting in its own right. But also, like, I think in a lot of great writing, a lot of good writing works through dynamism, right? Like, you get a lot of variety between senses of scale, between the rhythms of the sentences and the paragraphs. And like, talking about microbes is inherently about scale. It's about how the very small affects the lives of the very big. And by playing with that difference, with that rise and fall of perception, you can create a lot of like interesting effects. I think it makes the study of microbes like weirdly subversive. The idea that like these very familiar, very big things could be profoundly influenced by things that are very small and might be overlooked and dismissed.
What is an example of a favorite microbe subversion moment that you've had to write about, or that you've wanted to write about, I should say?
Oh, so one of my favorites that I write about extensively in the book is a thing called Wolbachia, which is a bacterium that is found inside the majority of insects and can change their behavior, can manipulate their reproductive cycles. Wolbachia is really good at spreading through large populations because it moves through the maternal line, and it gives itself more hosts to inhabit by changing males into females, by doing all sorts of interesting tricks, like biological tricks. And it also has applications for human health too, because it's useful for things like controlling dengue fever, possibly malaria and other illnesses. So yeah, it's super interesting. It's a really great example of some really cool basic biology that then has enormous practical applications because that we only knew about because we were interested in the thing in itself.
So it was sort of it was mind controlling insects, but it could help us with therapies for diseases.
For sure, yeah.
Okay, it's good to know that we can like transplant mind controlling, bacteria into our cells. It's good. So Rebecca, tell us about how you got interested in this cell line that became kind of the centerpiece of your book.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to back up to your sort of original question of just like, how do you get people to care about this stuff and make it interesting? And I was just watching Ed answer that question. To me, it's sort of an answer to that question, which is, you know, you could just see he's excited about this. He's like, this is so cool. I have to tell you about it. And like, that's the beginning of it. To me, it's about obsession in some way. You have to, like, the person who's writing about the science has to see it in this way and feel the obsession with it and feel like, no, you have to understand how cool this is. Right. So like, I think there's, to some degree it starts there. And yeah, so I was just watching Ed do that. I was like, that right there, that thing he's doing is part of what's important about it is, you know, just the writer being excited. And yeah, and, you know, I think the other aspect of that, so the difference between the kind of science writing that I do and I think to some degree what Ed does, it's like, I do these big sprawling narratives, right? Which is, in my defense, why I think it takes me 11 years to do it.
Fair enough.
You know, so for me, it's, you know, it's the stories that make it so people can and want to understand the science. So for me, it's all about finding the narrative. I think, we are storytelling creatures. Humans have learned through storytelling since the beginning of time. Cave paintings, Ed's wife, Liz Neely, is a master at talking about this very thing. And she has this organization called Story Collider that really focuses
which
on—
is fantastic.
which is amazing, and which focuses on story as a vehicle for conveying science and important science. And so I've always been a big believer in that. I was a science person. I came to science writing as a science person. I was actually an undergrad in a basic biology class when I first learned about HeLa cells, which is what the first book is about. And, I heard my teachers say, there are these amazing cells. They've been around since 1950, even though the woman they came from died in 1951. And they've been alive in labs longer than she was ever alive. They were one of the most important things that happened in medicine. And I was like, what? Who is this person? And why don't we know about her? And what is her? And the only thing he knew about her was her name, which was actually, it turns out, very unusual. Most people, there was a fake name that had been used for years. But he knew her real name and that she was Black, and that was it. And I was just like, there's a whole story there. What, who, why? These are amazing cells. Why? And I went up to him after class and asked him what else we knew about her, and did she have any kids, and what do they think about it? And he was just like, nobody knows. And I just could not let that go. And, so I was obsessed with that from the time I learned about the cells when I was 16. So that was 1988. The book came out in 2010. I wasn't immediately like, I'm going to become a writer. I thought I was going to become a veterinarian. But I never let go of this obsession about these cells and the story. And, when we talk about stories about cells, about microbes and all that, it's like, we're not just writing about— there is no story that is just about a cell or just about a microbe, right? There is this whole world. I mean, this is Ed's title, right? I contain multitudes. Like, it's just, the whole world actually exists. Cells, microbes make it all up. And so to me, it's about finding the stories that show people why this is relevant to them and why they should care about it. And so for me, it was obviously, the story, when I would describe the book, when I was first working on it, I would say, I'm writing a book about the first immortal human cells ever grown in culture. And people just go, ugh. Their eyes would glaze over. I'd be like, but wait, it's really interesting. They came from a Black woman named Henrietta Lacks. She didn't know that they took the cells. They were taken without her knowledge. Her children were used in research for decades afterwards without their knowledge. Everyone's benefited from these except her family. And it's a very different story than just saying it's about cells. And really, there is some kind of human story behind every single bit of science. And to me, the job of the science writer is sort of finding that and figuring out how to convey that to the public. And for me, that's through narrative. So I look, like when I'm doing my reporting, I look for scenes as they're unfolding. So I write, my goal is always to have my writing read like a novel, but be completely journalistically accurate. Like, I want it to feel like a cinematic film almost. And so I watch very intensely for moments where science is happening in a narrative way. So like in the book, there's this moment when Henrietta's daughter goes and sees her mother's cells for the first time, and we're in a lab. And this is like this enormous culminating moment in her life. She's sort of terrified, she's excited. And for the first time in decades, there is a scientist explaining science to Henrietta's family. And that's just, no one ever stopped to do that before, which was part of their story. And in that moment, in that room, it was one of the most moving experiences of my life to watch it. It was moving for everyone. We were all very emotional. And the reporter brain was going, oh, this is the scene where everyone is going to learn about the basic science. So you get to that scene in the book, and through him explaining to her what a cell is, how DNA works, she isn't going to die from the same cancer because those were her mom's cervical cancer cells, and it was caused by HPV, a virus, which she didn't catch when she was a kid. It was like, there's so much information packed in this one scene. And to me, the job of this kind of writing is to have people read it and they're just in a scene and they're just caring about everything that's happening, and they get to the end and go, oh, I accidentally whoops, I learned some science, I think. And I didn't even really register that I was doing that. And so to me, that's the job.
That's so great. One of the things that's been so interesting about, reading your book and then seeing kind of the cultural ripples coming out of it. I know you've stayed in touch with the family and you've been working with them a lot. And I wonder if, as you're watching news about the pandemic unfold and, you know, people are learning about how Black communities have been really underserved by the medical establishment, do you feel like that story that we're seeing now is kind of a continuation of the Henrietta Lacks story?
Oh, sure. Yes, of course. In so many different ways. You know, and on the science side of things, and the HeLa cells are being used to help us try to figure out COVID. So I have this growing file on my desktop of the ways that HeLa cells have contributed to COVID research. And, you know, right out of the gate, as soon as COVID started happening, some scientists used HeLa cells to figure out how COVID gets into the cell. Like, what's the receptor that COVID needs in order to actually invade a cell and infect someone? They figured that out using HeLa cells immediately.
Amazing.
Yeah, amazing. Like these, you know, all these years later, there's still this kind of go-to cell that's helping the world. And, you know, this is one of the things that made the story so impactful for so many people, I think, is as you're reading the story and understanding what happened to her family, you see yourself in these pages, because, you know, any vaccine you've ever gotten was in part thanks to HeLa cells. In vitro fertilization, anybody who had a child that way or was born that way, you have Henrietta and her family to thank. And, you know, all of our most important cancer medications. So like, that is part of the story of what the world got when the Lacks family lost Henrietta. So you kind of can't separate the story of what's happening with the cells from the story of the family. And yeah, in the story of the family, you cannot separate that from the history of race in America. You know, Henrietta's cells were taken at Johns Hopkins in the colored ward, which was during the era of segregation. That was the only place where she could get treatment. And it was standard practice to do that across the country. I mean, colored wards were where you did research, and, you know, without consent, and a lot of it very invasive, not just at Hopkins, but everywhere. And you know, and as the family story goes along, yeah, race is present throughout, including decades after Henrietta's cells were taken, her children were used in research without their consent. And that was clearly a moment when had they been a white family, their experience probably would have been quite different. And, you know, the mistrust that exists in the Black community from the Tuskegee syphilis studies, where Black men were not treated and were studied to see how syphilis would kill them, even though a treatment existed. You know, Henrietta's story, there's just, all of this relates to what we're talking about now in having to do with racism in science and the world. So yeah, so of course this is all very tied together with the current moment. And one of the things that I'm hopeful about is that, you know, at a lot of Black Lives Matter protests, I've started seeing signs. Henrietta Lacks matters.
That's so
I'm
awesome.
Here for Henrietta. Yeah, like, and I mean, I'm just even saying that it's just like, gives me goosebumps. And, you know, that is happening is amazing. And also within the world of science, you know, there is this Black in STEM, and there's a movement now to recognize the racism that exists in science. You know, and, you know, I established this Henrietta Lacks Foundation, which helps the Lacks family, and it's also helped some members of the Tuskegee syphilis studies men with education and access to healthcare. And so far, everyone who's donated to that has just been like individual readers who want to help. No organization has donated. And in this moment, there's a lot of talk going on within academia and within the research world saying, what do we owe Henrietta's family? And that's not a conversation anyone has ever actually entertained in a financial way, or in any way, really. So, you know, when the book came out, there was a lot of talk of, oh, we need to teach her story, we need to learn her story, we need to recognize her story. But anytime questions of what do we owe the family came up, people would say, well, it's, you know, you can't, it's complicated. It would set a precedent if we give to her family and do anything for her family, because then what do we do with all the other cells that are used in research? And my response has always been, well, yes, there's lots of cells that have been used in research without people's knowledge, but we only know who Henrietta is. We don't know who those people are. Henrietta's name was released, her medical records were published, her children were used in research. That didn't happen to the other people. And so there is this moment now, I think, where people are sort of actually saying, wait, oh, we should do something. And so I've had a few organizations. We're just actually tomorrow, I think, going to announce that have just gotten our first donation from a for-profit company that part of their existence is that they benefit from HeLa financially. And so they've given to the foundation. And so I'm hoping that will continue and that this will be a moment where there will be actually, an influx of funds that will help the Lax family, hopefully for generations. But what's also interesting is that online, there's a lot of talk about, and then I'll stop, what should be done in response to this. And there's been a call that I've been seeing to boycott HeLa and stop using HeLa because they were obtained in an unethical way. And I saw that just recently pop up on Twitter, and I was just like, oh no, that's not what the Lax family would want at all. They're proud of these cells. They want them to continue to help people. They just want to be a part of it, and they want to be recognized, and they want to be, helped. And so I think it's interesting that in this moment, in some ways, it's another moment where things are happening related to HeLa and Henrietta's legacy, and no one has thought to ask the family what they actually want. So we're working on this will become clear. We're going to put out we're going to put out some stuff to make it clear, like, no, the family does not want you to stop using HeLa but, do other good things. So it's a big moment for that. And I've mostly just been like, I want to put their voices out there in this moment. They do a lot of public speaking, and I'm excited for them to be in the center of this.
That's fantastic. All right, so let's, I'm gonna talk to you guys for a few more minutes and then we'll open it up for questions, but I wanted to be sure that we moved briefly away from the human world and all of our human issues to talk to you both about animals, because I know you're working on books about animals, and this is very exciting to me. And I'm super interested in animal behavior. So I wonder if you could just tell us, what are your books about? Like, what are you thinking about animals? You've moved from single cells to multicellular creatures, non-human animals, which are the best animals in my opinion. I mean, I like human animals too. They're great. So tell me, so Ed, you're in front of animals right now, non-human animals.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
So the book I'm writing about, which is halfway done and has briefly been interrupted by a global pandemic, is
a little bit important, yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So it's about the way other animals perceive the world around us through smell, vision, electric and magnetic sensors, heat sensors, all the rest. So it's about how dogs smell the world. It's about how bats and dolphins echolocate. It's about how electric fish sense the world through electric fields. The idea is that we could all be in the same room with a whole menagerie of other species, and they would all experience the same reality that we share in completely different ways. And that that our senses give us a very, very thin slice of all there is to know and experience. And I hope that by showing how other creatures experience that same world, we'll get a deeper, broader, grander view of things that we once thought were familiar. So I've had a ton of fun traveling to a bunch of labs when traveling was a thing we did. And visiting people when visiting people was a thing we did.
Yeah.
To do things like, so I've been to labs that study manatees and naked mole rats and bats and moths, spiders. I've been punched by a mantis shrimp. I've been electrocuted by a catfish. I have seen all sorts of incredible things, and I really can't wait to share this book with people. I think it just constantly blows my mind what other creatures are capable of, and just the very, very different ways in which even very familiar things, dogs, songbirds, experience our shared reality.
Was there an animal that you've met during your research that was particularly memorable, like a particular individual where you were like, I kind of feel like I got to know that particular creature?
I liked Sprouts, who is a harbor seal, who lives in Santa Cruz, I think.
It's a good place to be a
Not far from Rebecca. And so Sprouts has taken part in a lot of studies over the years about how seals have a hydrodynamic sense, which means that they can track the movements of fish in the water long after those fish have swum past. So a fish swims through the water, it leaves behind a stream of turbulent eddies that you obviously cannot see, but that persists for a surprisingly long time. And seals can track that with their whiskers. So Sprouts is almost completely blind, but the researchers who I met did this little simple test where they put a long pole with a ball in it in the water, dragged it in front of Sprouts, and then after a while, the seal goes off and follows the path of the ball exactly. And I don't mean just going in the rough general direction. I mean following it up and down, side to side, exactly where the ball was. And that's just incredible. The idea that what just looks to me to be completely uniform, boring water is just full of information that an animal with the right physiology and with the right brain can process and read. And that's sort of the core of what the book is. And also Sprouts gave me a kiss, and also Sprouts, I have a recording on my phone of what Sprouts sounds like, and it is not what I expected.
Yeah, it's like when I learned that hawks sound like babies, they're just they have these insanely silly little voices, and you're like, what?
Oh,
you're a raptor.
I wrote a piece for The Atlantic about how people have no idea what animals sound like. We know what dogs sound like, we know what cats sound like, and we have farmyard animals kind of nailed down. But in the main, we have no idea what animals sound like, and most of what animals sound like would freak you out.
Fantastic. Okay, Rebecca, tell us about your book about animals. I know you used to be a veterinarian, or you worked, so.
I was so a little known fact about me is I was a veterinary technician, a nurse for animals. So I was planning to go to vet school. I was going to be a veterinarian. And part of how I worked my way through school was as a technician. So I worked in various areas of veterinary medicine for about a decade. I worked in general practices, I worked in shelters, I worked in the morgue at a vet school for quite a few years, an emergency room. I also ended up working with some research animals. And the book, this is we need hours for me to actually explain. So this is, I often joke that when I described the first book, when I was at this point, I would say it's about these cells and there's these people and this family and this is amazing, but it's going to be really interesting. And that's basically my description of this book now. It's it's this animals and stuff, but it's going to be really interesting. So you have to just grant me that right now. Just trust me, it's going to be interesting. But yeah, it's funny. When I first started working on the book, I was saying, this is a book about humans and animals and our relationships, and it's not. It's a book about animal research and animal rights, and this is in many ways like HeLa cells. Animals in research are everywhere. People don't know that for the most part, and they don't really want to know that. And one of the reasons why the HeLa cell story was so impactful for so many people is that everyone's benefited from HeLa cells. And if you've benefited in 10 ways or 100 ways from HeLa cells, you've benefited in thousands of ways from animal research. So it's just this, in some ways, it's a similar story, but bigger in scale. And, what the world knows about animal research is actually very minimal. And part of that is part of the narrative that I'm telling is why don't we know what animal research really looks like? Why don't we talk about this? So in the 80s, when animal rights activists really started becoming a thing in the US in a real way, the response to that, these raids of labs and things, the response was that the world of science just went underground. Essentially, they put up security gates and cameras, and they said, just go back into your labs, keep doing your work. this will go away. And it didn't. And what it did do was it created this big gap between what the public understands of science and what's happening, but also just made it so animal research is happening in this way that feels incredibly secretive to the public. And really the only information the public gets is, most of it is from animal rights groups, and the world of science just doesn't respond for the most part. And so when I did work in a couple different animal research kind of facilities, and they were both at the vet school at Colorado State University, and it was one of these places where, as a veterinary technician, I just got assigned to different jobs, and so I worked with people's pets part of the time, and then I was in the morgue part of the time, and then I was over here helping with these research dogs. And I did not go into veterinary medicine thinking I wanted to work with research dogs, and I had all sorts of opinions about the use of dogs in research that was, seemed horrifying to me. And, it wasn't something that I just hadn't even entertained it, which most people don't. I was a kid who grew up wanting to volunteer for PETA, and I had my little fur is murder t-shirt that I wear all the time. And I ended up working, just sort of being assigned to work with some of these dogs, and fell in love with them, and they were part of cardiac research for humans, where they would go in and create a heart defect in the dogs and then go in and try to repair them as part of developing this treatment for humans. And that was in some ways the beginning of me as a writer. The very first stories I ever wrote were me grappling with the emotions of that, of caring for these animals, loving these animals, naming them, wanting them to have very good lives, also understanding I couldn't take them out of those labs, and seeing the other people who were working with them and how much they actually cared for them, and how that was just so complicated, and how that conflicted with a lot of what I imagined the people who worked with animals in research, like how much that conflicted. And so that was in the 90s, right? That was like a long time ago. And then I wrote what turned out to be, I have hundreds of pages of stuff that I wrote from back then that was just me hemorrhaging the material. Wow. And actually my writing, this is the first writing class I ever took, and it was obviously it was therapy for me to some degree. And my writing teacher at that point, he wrote on my final for the semester, he wrote, something like, I have that exact quote somewhere, but he said, "Don't be afraid to really explore this material and to show your emotions about it, and to talk about what's hard here." And he said, it seems like there's maybe a book here. This is before I was thinking about becoming a writer. And he said, "I don't know, snapshots from the lab." And he said, "The only problem is there's no ending yet." And I just put that away, and I went and wrote the first book, and then when the first book came out, I started thinking about what's next. And the only thing I could think of that I was ever as obsessed with and driven to find the answer to, as I was with HeLa cells, was this question of, what does animal research look like? Who decides what of this is essential? What isn't essential? Are there alternatives? Why aren't there alternatives? Like, how do we actually answer these questions? And so that's where this book started, was me going back to try to answer questions that I came up with a long time ago, which were, what does animal research look like in the world? How has it changed since the 80s, which is kind of when the public stopped being able to really know what it looked like? What still needs to change? What probably isn't going to change? Like, where do we not have alternatives, and how do we think about those, and how do we talk about those? And also, we love animals, and how did we get to this place where this is a topic that is so hard for people to talk about? So it's impossible to have a nuanced conversation, because often it comes down to, are you pro or are you anti? And really the reality is, like, most people are some mishmash of the middle. And so in some ways it's a similar, narratively, it's a similar story. There's a lot of people who are fighting for something that they believe in very deeply on both sides. There are people who are very afraid to talk. Part of the Lax family story is they had been through so much, they were very afraid. So there's a lot of people, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of, and then there's a lot of just amazing stories. And I set out for years, I've been going around and just immersing myself in different research facilities, also different sanctuaries where the animals are retired, talking to people in the world of lab animals, talking to the animal rights activists, and sort of sometimes I'm like, I could have just like written a book about puppies. Like that would have been easier. I don't know why exactly.
We would all read it.
So Rebecca and I have joked about this before, that like she's not only an incredible writer who produces incredible books, but she also produces incredible material for like book talks. Because like all of your like, what is the origin story of this book answers are like, I went on like this incredible journey that like draws on my entire past and being, and the rest of us are like, I liked this thing, so I wrote a book about this thing. What do you want?
Come on, Ed, you got kissed by a seal, right?
I
Also,
did,
I would
right.
like to remind you where we started. This, for those of you who weren't here earlier, this is a note that randomly was sitting on my desk, and it's from Ed Yo, which is what I call him. And it says, you've averaged like 2 words per year since your book came out. And this was several years ago. So this was in joking about the fact that I've only published like 2 op-eds since my book came out, but I've been working really hard. So,
yeah,
yes,
this is 2 words per year that you know of. That's
right, yeah. And they're two like best-selling words, I'll have you know.
Exactly. All right. So we're getting a lot of questions from the audience. So I wanted to ask a couple of those. So I'm kind of going to combine a couple of questions because a lot of people are asking about thinking about animal rights. Jeannie mentioned the Non-Human Rights Project. And Miriam Horn asks whether if you're thinking about ways that we're learning about how things that humans do can actually harm animals in ways that we didn't know, because we're now learning more about their senses. She mentions ship sounds, driving whales mad or interfering with their sense of direction. So I guess like this is sort of for you, Ed, but it's also for you, Rebecca. I think, how are you grappling with that question of how do we give animals rights? How do we understand their rights in the context of research, but even in the context of like having a pet? How do we think about that?
Yeah, so I'll just quickly answer the second bit of that. So the last chapter of the book is in fact about how humans have disrupted the sensory worlds of other animals. So whether through things like light pollution, noise pollution, chemical pollution, there's so much to talk about, and a lot of the ways in which we have built our societies, our urban spaces, flooded the world with extra light and noise is very detrimental to animals whose senses work in a very different way than ours do. And I don't want to say too much about that right now because I haven't written the chapter yet, but it is a big issue. I was also really interested in talking to a woman named Alexandra Horowitz, who has written several fantastic books about dogs and their senses. She's a character in the book. She's in the whole section about dogs and smell. But she writes about how she will take her dogs on smell walks, where the whole point of the walk is not to exercise the dog or to really give the human something to do, but to allow the dog to explore the world in this very olfactory way. And that a lot of the behaviors that dog owners have pull dogs away from that world, right? Like if they stop to sniff something, you want to hurry them along, or if they try and sniff something that you think is gross, you pull them away from that. And she tries to let her dogs like explore the world with their noses in the way that they normally would. Which I think is just a beautiful way of thinking about how like we can cater our behavior to the very different sensory experiences of other animals.
Yeah, that's so great. I love the idea of a smell walk. Did you want to add anything to that, Rebecca? Or
I mean, I just want to say, this question, I think the phrasing was, how are we grappling with the question of how do we give animals rights? And my answer to that was just yes. Like that's basically what my book is about. And in a narrative, complicated way that's like, oh, and it's really interesting. I mean, and how, like we are all so emotionally entwined with animals, and also environmentally entwined. Like our impact on them in every way is just enormous, and their impact on us is enormous, and sort of how we wrestle with that. And so I couldn't possibly answer that question like now, but it is what the book is really about in some ways, and also just what does it mean to advocate for animals' rights, And who is doing that? And I think the answers to those things can be pretty surprising for people. That there are people advocating for the rights of animals and the needs of animals in places that they wouldn't expect that to be happening, like in the midst of a really big research facility, and that there's no uniformity in how anyone defines animal rights and how you lobby for those and what that means and at what points does that actually become harmful for animals, or is it, and is it good for animals? So it's just this very messy question that, basically is going to take me. It's just like, when people ask me about, so what is did the Lax family deserve X? And I say, well, so it's this really long story and you have to understand all the pieces. Like, that's good. That's my answer for this one too right now. It's like, I gotta finish the book.
Yeah, it's a super nuanced issue.
Yeah.
And like, there's so many questions within all those questions.
Yeah. I think my goal with it is to really, like with the first book, to come at it so that people can really see all of the story in its nuances. Like, in the first book, you learn about the scientists, you learn about all of their motivations, and you learn that these are not evil demons that stole her cells because they thought she was going to make them millions of dollars, which is what people always imagined. And and so I think a lot of my job as a writer is to say, look, this is the actual information, this is what that world looks like and feels like, and this is who the characters are, and all these people who are doing pretty amazing things in that people don't really know about in all different sides, right? The animal rights side and the science side. And so to sort of put that out there and then say, discuss. And I'll be a part of that discussion, but like the book to me is the starting place for that conversation, which is how I felt about the first one too.
All right, so we have a question from Rose Eveleth, who's also an excellent science journalist.
Hi, Rose.
And Rose asks, both of you, how do you weave these cinematic stories that feel narrative and gripping without anthropomorphizing animals in ways that might actually be non-scientific and inaccurate? So this is a question I also had too about anthropomorphization. So Ed, you want to start? And also maybe tell us what anthropomorphization is for those of us who have not remembered our very specific terms.
Right. So I think it's about explaining what animals are feeling and doing in human terms,
Sure.
and certainly that is using human emotions or human behaviors. I think that is very much a risk. In some ways, so I'll say two things about it. Like, in some ways, the book I'm working on is itself a guardrail against that, because the explicit point of the book is to try and get into the heads of other animals. So I spent a huge amount of time thinking, like, actually, what is another animal experiencing? And like, we will never really know. The philosophers have written about how we will never really know, but we can take educated guesses. And I think in doing so, it itself acts as a bit of a sense check against that tendency to read human behavior into what animals are doing. But I think like the counterpoint to I can never say the bloody word, anthropomorphism is
anthropomorphization.
There's too many syllables. There's definitely like 3 syllables in the middle where I'm like, do these need to be here? Every time anyway, the opposite of that is what people have called anthropodenialism, which is to suggest that is to deny animals a certain amount of agency or intelligence or emotional richness on the grounds that they are not humans and that they are different from us. And clearly, the reality lies in between these extremes. Like, animals are not us, but they're not also like automatons. They're not inanimate. We share a common ancestor. Our brains share a common ancestor. And so there will definitely be similarities in how they experience the world. The trick is not to reject that entirely, but to carefully delineate where those similarities lie. And to wholeheartedly embrace both the similarities and the differences. You know, like people talk a lot about octopuses being intelligent, right? And I think they clearly are, but their intelligence is very different to our intelligence because they're built in very different ways. So octopuses have huge amounts of nervous system hardware running into their arms. The arms in many ways act as these independent entities that don't do a lot of stuff like without consulting the brain. They do a lot of chemical sensing, a lot of mechanical sensing, and there is a lot of intelligence built into the octopus's arms that don't necessarily involve the head in the way that we would normally think of. Like my arms aren't moving independently. They're not typing away, writing a piece by themselves, although I wish they would. And so like even when you think about this animal that is very, very different from us and that has all these incredible abilities and is intelligent, you need to understand that it's a very different kind of intelligence, like how that is built up, how that has evolved, under what pressures, all of that. But you know, that's different from either saying they're not intelligent or they are exactly like us and super smart. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I wanted to
can I add something?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So I mean, this is to me is very key to a lot of what I'm writing about. In some ways, because I mean, I just wanted to sort of second everything you said about the importance of actually acknowledging where these traits do exist in animals and that they're not automatons and everything. And actually this argument that it is anti-scientific to anthropomorphize animals is something that has historically been used to let us mistreat animals. So when within the world of, you know, when there is something that is happening to an animal that is uncomfortable, you know, I think one of the responses has been, well, but they aren't, you know, you don't know, what does this mean? Do they feel pain? We don't know if they feel pain. Do they feel like us? Are they upset by this? Do they really want to be in a cage by themselves? Or are they, you know? And so this anthropomorphizing argument can actually be a dangerous one. And so for me, that's part of the story is, okay, yes, it is also dangerous to say they are like us because they're not. And in fact, when we treat animals like animals in captivity in a laboratory as if they are like us, that can lead to problems. Like if you think, oh, we should toss this monkey in with this group of monkeys because, you know, wouldn't a monkey love to be with a lot of other monkeys and then they all kill each other? You know, so you have to think like a monkey, you have to understand the monkeys, but also, you know, divorcing yourself from that and saying, well, we can't, you know, just because a human would want to not be alone, that doesn't mean that a monkey doesn't want to be alone. And so, you know, I think that's all part of the story of it. And that's in some ways how I avoid the trap of anthropomorphizing in a dangerous way, is to really look at what is anthropomorphizing and what is that word kind of, how has that word been used to let us keep us off the hook of thinking about what animals actually do feel and need. You know, and as I said, there's so much science that shows us that, you know, intelligence and love and grief, like these things exist in animals. And part of the story too, for me, is anthropomorphizing humans a little bit. That's yes. That we also tend to not do in science. And, you know, in the world of animal research, that's a big one. There's, you know, historically, it's been, you know, don't name the animals there, you know, and there's been a big movement away from that in the world of animal research to acknowledge the fact that humans have these emotions for animals, and that that it's actually healthy for them to share those with the animals, because it makes everyone think about research differently. And so, yeah, so I think part of my work, I tend to try to, I don't know if anthropomorphizing humans is a thing, but
I think it is. I instantly knew what you meant by that, because that is part of, as you guys were saying earlier, it's part of making science writing really exciting, is showing how the people doing it are just regular people with all kinds of hangups and weird obsessions, just like the rest of us.
Right. And that dangerous things happen when we don't acknowledge that, either in the world of animals or in humans.
That's right. Yeah. Ed, I think this is a question for you, and I'm going to leave it to you to untangle, because it's kind of exciting. Joanne Green asks, get ready. Okay. If humans' microbiomes cause emotions and humans share some of the same bacteria and viruses with animals, I assume, can't we apply what we learn about human emotions to animal emotions? So if we're, I guess the idea is if we're sharing our microbiomes, are we also sharing feelings? I could be misinterpreting the question.
So, no is the answer, because the reason why it's no, and it's not an unreasonable question, but I think put it this way, the reason why microbes influence our emotions is that they produce things like neurotransmitters, so chemicals that affect our moods, because they influence the immune system, because they do stuff that is complicated, and it's not like there are microbes that produce fear, or I don't have a guilt microbe or an ennui microbe. It's not so, and so the presence of any one microbe does not render a particular emotion in its host. And so you can't say that because a human and animal contains similar microbes that they must feel the same way. That would be way too simple. But that being said, we have the reason why a lot of the mechanisms that I've talked about are also shared. Like I said, we share a common ancestor. Biologically, we have a ton of similarities. So the overlaps are not simple, but there is some shared basis to what we have, to the experiences we have, and I think that is kind of beautiful.
Yeah. So we had a
wait. Oh, someone muted Rebecca. Someone
what?
Unmute.
Can please unmute Rebecca. Please anthropomorphize Rebecca. You will no longer be allowed to speak.
Right.
Yes.
Oh man.
Did you want to add to that, or I haven't?
No,
I want to
I
ask
just wanted
one
to
more.
not be muted.
Okay, yeah. So I think we've got time for one more question, maybe two. We'll see how fast you guys can go. This is from Kishore Hari, and he asks, and I think this is really for both of you. In your work, how do you find the line between reporting and advocating for the principles and people that you cover?
So I am not an advocate. I'm pretty clear about that.
But you advocate for science.
Do I though? I advocate for, no, in fact, I don't, I'm not even sure I do that.
Okay.
I think that I care about science as a way of understanding the world. And I think it is deeply interesting to me. I think the natural world is really interesting to me. The closest I come to advocacy is saying the natural world is important and we should care about it. Like Rebecca said, science writ large has also had its fair share of ethical missteps and deeply troubled legacies that we need to contend with. So I don't think one can say I advocate for science if you don't also mean I advocate for the bad treatment of Henrietta Lacks and people at Tuskegee and so on, right? So I think part of the role of a journalist is to be a watchdog for those things, as well as, the way I phrase it is it's about unraveling bad stories as well as telling good ones.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Rebecca?
Yeah, I think, this is something I think about a lot and wrestle with a lot. And I think, to me, when I teach, I talk about this a lot, like science journalism, science writing is not science cheerleading. That is not our job. There is actually a field that's job is essentially science cheerleading, and that is, science communications, and, there are communications offices, that's their job. And, is to go out there and tell everybody this is amazing and everything. And that's not what we do. What I consider myself, I consider myself a very hardcore advocate for facts and information. So I think, the thing that I guess that's the line that I keep in my head and that I really work very hard to maintain is I am not writing something that is pro something or anti something. I am not writing an argument for animal research or against animal research. What I'm writing about is, and essentially arguing is, we need to have a conversation about blank That tends to be the, like, you could say that about everything I've written. We need to have a conversation about blank. It is not a black and white issue that people, as people often want complicated things to be. In order to have this conversation, you need to know the facts. And these are the facts. And I advocate very fiercely for the facts part of that. And also for saying people should have a voice in being able to share their stories, whether those are the animal rights people, the science people, the Lax family, the scientists, you know, it's not, so I think that's where, that's the line that I always try to, that don't even try. I mean, it's just like, this is who I am. I sort of, so I do consider myself in some ways a fierce advocate for that. And you know, I'm also very aware of, I'm like putting this particular book out at a time when that's a challenging thing to advocate for sometimes. But yeah, I feel like that's our job, is not necessarily to advocate for science, but to advocate for the facts of what's happened. Why is this important for you to know about? And what do you need to consider in order to make an educated decision about what you believe, whether it's what you believe about Henrietta Lax's family and the HeLa cells, what you believe about animal research versus animal rights. Like, I can't tell, I would never tell someone, here's what you should believe about that. But I would like to give people the information so they can make their own decision, because people will have different feelings about it. Everyone will actually come down on a spectrum of how they feel. But doing that without the facts is something that leads to bad things.
So, okay, for our final question, lightning round, we've gotten a lot of questions about science education and what we can do to educate kids, what we can do to educate everyone, ourselves. So I wonder if each of you, before we go, could name a place or a book or a resource that people could go to if they're interested in science education and getting some of those facts that we've been talking about. You can cheat and say The Atlantic if you want, Ed.
Yeah.
Are you talking about like for kids or just in general?
For kids or for adults. I think in general would be nice, because we've got a lot of adults on the call.
Okay, so I am actually going to cheat and say The Atlantic, but I'm gonna give you a specific reason for that, right? So I think that we are currently in the midst of the most important, not just science story, but just like omniversal story of the moment. I think the pandemic has uprooted our lives to such an incredible extent, and people are starved for good, accurate information. And what we try to do, myself and the rest of our team, is to give people that information, not just by giving them like these little bite-sized morsels of what is going on, but by doing these, big, sweeping, analytical, thoughtful pieces that hopefully will give people a solid foundation from which to observe this raging torrent of news and developments. So I think that I'm so proud of what the entire team has done to rise to the informational challenges of this crisis.
Yeah, you guys are doing a great job, and tons of great data-driven work. And Ed is writing constantly and tirelessly about the pandemic, and taking us on a lot of unusual pathways, like not just the usual kind of like, here are all of the little nubs on top of the virus. And here's how they work, which I also love. And Ed also appears regularly on Shortwave, which is a fantastic resource too, which is NPR's daily science podcast. It's a 10-minute podcast and it gives you science news every day. Highly recommended. Okay, Rebecca, lightning round.
Yeah, I do not have an affiliation with The Atlantic, and I'm going to plug that also. I mean, I think, one of the things as a science writer who's not like a beat daily journalist, I'm not out there covering this stuff every day, but I am watching the coverage in horror most of the time, because I see so much science journalism that's not science journalism. Like we are at this unprecedented time in history where every journalist is being asked to be a science journalist, and most don't actually know the science and don't really know how to do that. And that's a whole field of study, and that's not saying they can't learn, but it's like, so I have been pretty scared of what I've been seeing in the world of journalism in some ways in this pandemic moment. And so for me, I just keep directing my friends. I'm like, go to The Atlantic. Ed is doing amazing stuff. They're not the only ones, but like, it's reliably good. And I've texted about this in the past. Like, I worry about the load that he and a few other people are carrying there but it's so good and so important, and they're just killing it in that on the pandemic side of things. And then in terms of just educational things that I think people should know about, actually, I plugged Story Collider earlier. I think absolutely amazing place people should see, understand, witness, support what they're doing, because that is a place where scientists are telling stories about science in order to educate the public. And that's so important. And for kids, I'm going to plug Science with Tom, which is this amazing, he's a middle school teacher who works with kids to make rap videos about science. They did one for Henry Lax, and it was one of the, will go down in history as one of my favorite things that was ever done connected to the book. And these are kids write the lyrics, they perform the videos, they make the videos, and they've done there's just a whole slew of those about science. And I think they're a great way for kids to learn about science, young and all the way through high school, but also a great teaching tool for people to use to try to do somewhat similar stuff on their own. And so his stuff is great too.
That's great. All right. So thanks everybody for coming out. This was a benefit for East Bay booksellers. You can order from them online. They're doing curbside pickup. We raised a ton of money for them today, and you guys are great. I just want to let you know that coming up next week, we have a very special show on Wednesday, which is devoted to our pets. And it's going to be me and Shannon McGuire and Fonda Lee and a bunch of other amazing authors showing off our pets, which will mean that my cats will just keep walking away. So I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. Other people will have better pets. And the following week, we have John Scalzi and Sarah Gailey, who are going to be benefiting Dark Carnival. So that's another great event coming up. So keep an eye out for that. Thanks again to Ed and Rebecca. You guys are awesome. I'm doing my like hand clapping symbol. And thanks for coming. Bye. People are slowly filing out.
I'm reading the questions. I can see.
Yeah.